PEM, or post-exertional malaise, is the exacerbation of symptoms after exertion, and that exertion can be physical, cognitive, or emotional exertion. So it's important for an ME patient to consider all three types of stressors that might contribute to their overall level of exertion and how that precipitates PEM. So people with ME typically have a selection or an assortment of symptoms. Many of them every person has who has the illness, but some of them vary, and why they vary we don't fully understand, but we do know that they typically encompass autonomic nervous system dysfunction. So the autonomic nervous system is part of your nervous system that governs the activities that you don't think about. For example, your ventilation, your breathing rate, your heart rate, your blood pressure, digestion, elimination, sexual function. Those are all things that are regulated by the autonomic nervous system and don't require volitional effort on your part. And exercise testing has shown us quite nicely that there is disruption in the autonomic nervous system. So many of the symptoms center around that any kind of disruption of all those types of functions I just listed could be part of your PEM signature, your PEM assortment of symptoms. But if the exacerbation or the exertion is severe enough, for some patients, they may actually experience different symptoms than they're accustomed to, new onset of symptoms with a severe PEM or flare, symptom flare. And that's not unthinkable, something to be aware of, because the best management of the illness is to avoid PEM altogether and to live your life in such a way as to avoid PEM. There are definitely central symptoms that everyone experiences. And those are the symptoms that typically make up the more popular questionnaires we might ask patients to fill out. So, for example, fatigue would be a symptom, cognitive dysfunction, and pain of some sort, muscle, joint, generalized pain, headache, swollen lymph or sore throats, repeated sore throats, sleep dysfunction. I don't think I've ever tested a patient who hasn't described unrefreshing sleep as part of their symptom profile. And oftentimes patients will also talk about gut dysfunction and hypersensitivity to environmental stimuli, so noise, light, busy environments in particular that require a lot of cognitive processing, odors, certain foods might exacerbate their symptoms. Part of their symptom profile might include new allergies to foods or medications that they didn't have previously before becoming ill. And but those first symptoms that I mentioned are common to most every patient who has ME-CFS. And of course, post-exertional malaise in an entity of itself, that when they exert beyond a certain level, that their collection of symptoms are all exacerbated. So to be really clear, that the people with ME-CFS have the symptoms to begin with. It's not, if they were to rate the symptoms, it's not as though they would be at 0 all of the time. They have the symptoms, which is why they're ill. Post-exertional malaise is an exacerbation of their symptom profile, and maybe an onset of new symptoms as well. So a cardiopulmonary exercise test is a test that's been used universally to evaluate the energy producing capacity of healthy people, athletes, people with various types of illnesses. And the difference between a cardiopulmonary exercise test and what we might refer to as a stress test typically is that during a stress test we monitor EKG, cardiac function, blood pressure, pulse oximetry or oxygen levels in the blood. That's done non-invasively. And during a cardiopulmonary exercise test, we typically monitor those same things in addition to expired gases. So an individual is wearing a face mask or a snorkel type of valve. It's called a two-way valve. So we can collect all of the air that they breathe out. And from that collection and analysis of expired oxygen and expired carbon dioxide, we can estimate quite closely the energy that is produced when they're doing a certain activity. For example, if we're measuring them at rest, then we could estimate their resting energy expenditure. If we're measuring them during exercise, we can estimate their exercise energy expenditure. Or if we're measuring them doing a certain task, such as climbing stairs or mopping or driving a car, we could estimate the energy expenditure required to do those tasks as well, or any task or activity of daily living, ADLs we call them. So we can measure quite nicely using expired gas analysis the energy that's required to do the task. And a 2-day test is a cardiopulmonary exercise test to first determine baseline measures for energy expenditure and also scrutinize cardiac function and other hemodynamic measures such as blood pressure and heart rate and ventilation. The reason that we do a second test typically 24 hours later, however, if we test a patient who knows that their PEM symptoms manifest more in 36 or even 48 hours, and some people do have that profile, then we'll even do the test 48 hours later. But typically it's done 24 hours later. So with the first test, we've determined their resting energy expenditure and their maximum exercise energy expenditure and how their cardiac function behaves during exercise and how their blood pressure changes during exercise. And when we bring them back 24 hours later and repeat the test, what we find in persons with ME-CFS is a number of different options for results. So, for example, we first thought that a signature pattern of change was that maximum oxygen consumption decreased on day 2 in ME patients. I've tested patients where that has not happened. In some patients, their oxygen consumption, when they get to a certain threshold in their incremental or graded exercise test, where their energy starts to be produced a little differently. So they start to transition from aerobic energy production to more anaerobic energy production. That's a critical point for us to know about for a patient with ME-CFS, because at that point, that's a demarcation of what we believe strongly to precipitate their PEM symptoms. So if they're doing some kind of activity that exerts beyond that break point or that anaerobic threshold, then they're more likely to precipitate their PEM symptoms. So the second test is to try to determine whether or not they can reproduce the first test normally, because healthy people, people with heart disease, people with pulmonary disease, all can reproduce their test on day 2 quite normally. We see very little variability from day 1 to day 2. But ME causes some kind of derangement in the autonomic nervous system and probably other areas of function that change their ability to produce energy on day 2. And we can document that when we do that second test. If we only did the first test, we wouldn't know if they would experience a change on the second test or a decrease in function. So that second test is critical to do that. It is not possible to cheat on this test, and I'll tell you why. Because we have known indices that we look at whenever we test anybody, whether it's an ME patient or whether it's an athlete, that tell us if the person's worked really, really hard. And the one caveat of doing the test is that we need to know that you work really, really hard when you do the test. During the test, we'll always push you to do your best as long as you're safe. And of course, during any test, the person doing the test is always in control, so they can stop the test at any time. However, if we want to compare your maximum energy producing ability on day 1 to day 2, we need to know that you gave maximum effort, your best effort. And while that may change on day 2 for someone with ME, we still need to know that you gave your best effort on day 2. And we do, as I said, we have certain indices that we look at to know that you have worked very hard. And they're physiological indices, in addition to one subjective index as well. But we generally look at 3 or 4 of those indices, and most patients I've tested are able to satisfy them. If they're unable to satisfy them, it may be for a reason related to the dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. And that's not unusual as well, especially on day 2, to see that happen. So one of the things that we learned from the 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test is that critical transition point I mentioned earlier, which is the onset of anaerobic metabolism. It's not truly an onset because anaerobic metabolism is happening all the time. But when you are exerting at low levels, most of the way that the energy is produced for those kind of activities, your walking around daily activities, is by aerobic or oxidative metabolism. When you begin to exert, for example, climbing a flight of stairs, your energy demands go up. And when we do a cardiopulmonary test, the test begins at resting levels, and then when we start you exercising, usually we collect data for about 3 minutes at rest, then we begin the exercise test. And the exercise intensity increases very gradually over the course of the test. The actual time that somebody exercises during a cardiopulmonary test is not very long. It's actually between 8 and 12 minutes. But during that 8 and 12 minutes, the exercise intensity increases systematically. And at some point during the test, the way that the person produces energy begins to shift from mostly aerobic energy production to predominantly anaerobic energy production. And anaerobic means without oxygen, and that's important because it is a way that we are able to produce energy to power activities that require a high energy demand quickly. So if you had to run out of a burning building quickly, the type of energy production that would allow you to generate energy fast enough to get up out of the chair and run down the hallway would be anaerobic energy production. And it's very good for doing that, but it's also a very short-lived process for producing energy. So you fatigue quickly when you produce energy anaerobically, yet you can produce a lot of energy very quickly, but that system sort of runs out very quickly. So if somebody lives in anaerobic energy production, you can understand then why they would be fatigued all the time, because it is a fatiguing means of producing energy. But a very effective for emergency needs, right? So finding out, as a person with ME, when you start to transition from aerobic energy production to more anaerobic energy production would be really helpful, because you would want to avoid any level of exertion that provokes anaerobic energy production, predominant anaerobic energy production. So one of the things that we look at when we do the exercise test is, what is your heart rate when you get to that transitional point where you start to produce more energy anaerobically? And we use heart rate as an index for that transition point because it's something easy to measure. You can wear a heart rate monitor or a Fitbit or some device to measure your heart rate or monitor your heart rate and know that you need to stay below a certain heart rate level. Now, with ME, what we find is if someone becomes post-exertional, oftentimes that threshold, that heart rate at anaerobic threshold, we call it, decreases when they're post-exertional, which now means that your threshold for doing activities of daily living just got smaller. So if you provoke your post-exertional response, you will lower your functional level and you will become fatigued more easily and provoke your post-exertional response at even lower levels of activity had you not gotten PEM'd, so to speak, to begin with. So it's important that you try as best you can to live your life below that heart rate at anaerobic threshold. And typically once I measure that and I know what it is, I'll recommend that a person stay at least 10 beats below that heart rate, because there is some measurement variability in how we determine that heart rate measurement at anaerobic threshold. So 10 beats below that is a little safer. And you'll find that you'll need to live your life a little differently to be able to achieve that goal. And I describe that means of living differently as living circularly. So living linearly would be something that you did before you became ill. You would perhaps get up in the morning and say, I have these 10 things I need to do today. I'll do number 1, and then I'll do number 2 and number 3 and so on, and then I hit the end of the day and then I go to bed. And that does not work if you have ME. So instead you get up in the morning and maybe you have task 1 to do, which might be to get out of bed and brush your teeth. And then instead of going right on to task 2, you need to recover from task 1. So you circle around. You do your task, you recover from your task. And then maybe you do task 2 and you recover from task 2. So it's a circle of exert and recover, exert and recover, all the while keeping your exertion level below your heart rate at anaerobic threshold guideline. And by doing that, you're much less likely to push yourself over that threshold and provoke your PEM symptoms. Realistically, there may be times during the day when you do push yourself over that heart rate. And if that's the case, and you happen to be wearing a heart rate monitor or device, then what I recommend is that you turn on the alarm for that device to correspond to your heart rate at anaerobic threshold minus 10 beats, and that alarm will come on when you exert at too high a level. And if it's important that you continue that exertion, try to do it as quickly as possible with as little time spent over your recommended heart rate as possible, and then recover for 6 to 7 times that amount of time you spent over that heart rate recommendation. So an example might be if you were climbing a flight of stairs and you were late for a doctor's appointment and you felt compelled to be there on time. I would suggest that you not be there on time, but if you felt compelled to be there on time and you had to climb that flight of stairs and your heart rate monitor went off halfway up the stairs and you took another 20 seconds to get up the stairs, then you need to sit in the doctor's office before you do anything else for 6 to 7 times that 20 seconds that you exerted above your prescribed heart rate. So that's exerting and then recovering before you exert again. Not just exerting and then going on to the next task and then going on to the next task and then being post-exertional later in the day or the next day and provoking all your post-exertional symptoms.